Alright guys, welcome back to Period 6, the APUSH curriculum. We are up to topic 6.9, Responses to Immigration in the Gilded Age. Let's get into the topic and see what we're going to learn, and we're going to try to figure out how and why Americans responded to increasing immigration between 1865 and 1898. So let's first look at some of these changes for the new immigrants. Now, we established in our last video that the new immigrants are people from Southern and Eastern Europe in particular, people like Poles and Greeks and Russians and Serbians and all those other groups over there. Now, before we get into any more detail, I'm sure a lot of us can probably pick out where we're at right here. Something you probably learned about before, at least I hope you have anyways, is called Ellis Island. And Ellis Island was one of the big processing places for new immigrants. So we'd come off the boat, and there they would get kind of a, once over, they'd fill out their paperwork and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things they would have is a brief medical exam just to make sure that people coming in were healthy, and if they had some sort of diseases, they could be put into quarantine or I guess perhaps even rejected altogether. All right, now, with the increase in the number of immigrants, particularly coming from countries that America was not used to seeing a lot of immigrants from, there were increasing debates over what exactly should happen in terms of assimilation and Americanization. Like, how exactly do we bring these people into America? And even among the immigrants themselves, they're also asking themselves these types of questions, like how much should I change to become an American? Now, one example you could point to is the name changes. So let's say you come over to America and your last name is Schmidt. Well, that sounds very, foreign, right? It sounds very German. So maybe instead of being called Schmidt, they call you Smith. Or instead of Schneider, you would use the German translation of Schneider, which is Taylor, right? In other words, Schneider is a tailor, and so instead of spelling like the job tailor, you would just call it Taylor. And you can see other variations on this kind of stuff. So changing one's name was somewhat common, or even if it's not changing the whole name, even just the spelling sometimes might make it easier to kind of blend in as an immigrant. Now, this is something that immigrants had to struggle with, and I'm sure they still do today, this idea of, okay, how far do I go in becoming an American, and how much of my old culture do I leave behind? Where do I cross the line? And so questions immigrants might have been asking themselves at that time period is, okay, do I send my kids to a Catholic school because I'm Catholic, or do I send them to a public school knowing that they'll be among other Americans, but they're also it's going to be secular, not going to be learning religion as they go to school? Should I be speaking my native language at home, or should I be speaking English at home? Is it okay to do that? Is it okay if my children are involved with people from outside of my ethnicity? What if an Italian marries a non-Italian? Is that okay? Should I change my last name to sound less Jewish? These are questions people have been asking themselves back then. All right, now with this influx of new immigrants, Americans they have to find a way to respond to this, and some Americans responded in a very positive way of finding ways to help these people adjust to their new lives in America. And a great example of this would be Jane Addams. In 1889, she opened something called Hull House in Chicago. And what Hull House is an example of a settlement house. And a settlement house is where basically it's a place that you would see in these major urban areas where immigrants could go. They could learn English there. There could be daycare for working mothers, and the kids while there, they could learn, elements of American culture and to kind of help them blend in and adjust and all that kind of stuff. So basically, again, it's a means for immigrants to learn how to blend in, learn how to negotiate this new American way of life. That's what a settlement house did. All right, let's now look at the other side of the coin of that whole idea of how do we react to immigrants by looking at nativism. This is certainly not the first time we've looked at nativism, and I love this political cartoon, guys, because there's so much truth in it, right? So you've got this new immigrant coming off the boat. He looks kind of poor and confused, and And these guys up here are like, I don't think so. We don't want you here. But in standing behind them, of course, are their ancestors. A reminder that, pretty much all Americans are descendants of immigrants in one way or the other. And so maybe we should maybe not be so quick to judge the next wave of immigrants going forward. Now, remind me, if you can, the anti-immigration political party we saw in the mid-1800s. What was the name of that group? And if you're thinking to yourself, Know Nothing Party, you are right. So the Know Nothing Party is gone, but some of their ideas lived on. And let's look at some of the fears of nativists, of these new immigrants. New immigrants tended to have more kids than native-born Americans, and so the fear was, well, gosh, these guys are going to come over here and they're all going to have 10 kids, and then they're going to have 10 kids, and before you know it, the whole country is going to be Italian or something like that. These were the fears people had. They also looked at Eastern and Southern Europeans as, frankly, inferior, that they were just not as good as Germans or Irish or British or French. There's something kind of just lowly about these people. That's the opinion people had in their mind. And they also feared that these people would bring in some new crazy ideas like socialism and communism. They'd come over here and they'd work for low wages, which would drive down wages for native-born Americans. So there was just a lot of fear going on. Now, as I said, the Know Nothing Party's long gone, but that's not to say their ideas don't live on. A good example of this would be the American Protective Association, or APA, established in 1887. Over 1 million Americans joined this organization, and basically their goal was to weaken Catholics, to make sure the Catholics didn't get too much political power, for fear that then the Catholic Church would rule over America, specifically, of course, the Pope. Now, Congress is also going to take up this fight. They're going to pass a series of laws designed to weaken the immigration into America. For example, in 1882, they're going to ban people with criminal records or people who are poor. That's what a pauper is. And then in 1917, they're going to include a literacy test as part of the immigration process. Now, this is something that had been vetoed 3 times, but Congress wanted it so badly they were able to override the president's veto. 1882, something happens called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and what this does is, for the first time in American history, we picked a particular group, in this case Chinese, and said, we don't want any more of you. So we just slammed the door shut on people of Chinese ancestry. And, this is something that's going to last for decades, all the way until the middle of World War II. Now, along with this sort of fear of immigrants and suspicion of immigrants comes this idea of social Darwinism. And this is something you learned about in world history. You may have forgotten about it. It's basically this idea of you're taking Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and you're applying it not to animals or something in the past, but rather you're applying it to the society around you. And of course, in America at this time period, there were some at the top who were very wealthy, and there were people at the bottom who had very little power, very little money. And by using social Darwinism, you could say, well, the people at the top deserve that success because they are superior, and the people at the bottom are poor because they are inferior. As William Grant Sumner, the guy at the bottom of your slide, said, the millionaires are a product of natural selection. In other words, if you're wealthy, that is proof that you are superior. And if you're poor, that's proof that you are inferior and your condition is inevitable. And you can't do anything about it. So there's a look here at our big businessmen, trying to protect against the working class here. Now, another way of looking at this is from a guy named Russell Conwell. So Russell Conwell wrote this thing called the Acres of Diamonds. It was a speech that he delivered hundreds and hundreds of times throughout his career. In fact, he got so wealthy from this speech that he was able to do a lot of philanthropy and helped establish Temple University in Philadelphia. And there are certainly some elements of social Darwinism peppered through this speech. I've given you 2 quotes here I think are pretty interesting. The first one says, 98 out of 100 of the rich men of America are honest. That is why they are rich. That is why they are trusted with money. So if you looked at that quote and then you flipped it, you would say that basically poor people are poor because they're dishonest, right? There is not a poor person in the United States who is not made poor by his own shortcomings. So what Russell Conwell is saying is you're poor because it's your own fault. And if you wanted to be rich, you would be rich. You'd work harder, you'd work smarter, and eventually you would be rich. That's what Russell Conwell is saying. All right, guys, so we covered a fair amount of ground in this video. We looked at changing settlement patterns and immigration patterns. We looked at some resistance to immigration with the nativist nativism. We looked at some congressional limits on immigration. We also talked about acres of diamonds and social Darwinism. So, yeah, that's it for this particular topic. In our next video, we'll roll on and keep on chugging through Unit 6.